All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started, but feel free to continue putting answers in the chat. And as usual, and if this is your first time at one of these webinars, if you have questions that arise during our conversation, feel free to put the questions in the chat, and we'll leave roughly 15 minutes at the end for audience questions that Anna from Project Coyote is going to field for you. So I'm Vanessa Chakour. I'm a Project Coyote ambassador, and I'm really, really excited to welcome Erica Berry today. We met actually when I reached out for a blurb for my book. And I hadn't read.
Beautiful book.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, so we've been in touch ever since and have huge just admiration for your work and your writing and all the sort of questions you pose in your writing, which was really central to the question of earthly bodies too, is how does storytelling alter our perception of other species? And that's going to be the core of our conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and read your bio, and then I'll invite you to read something for us.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Erica Berry's nonfiction debut, Wolfish, an amazing book, won the 2024 Oregon Book Award and was a semifinalist for the Pacific Northwest Book Award. Her forthcoming book, Bodies in Heat, Love in a Changing Climate, is coming out soon from Flatiron in the US and Faber in the UK. Her essays, often about the intersection between feelings of the natural environment, appear in the New York Times, Orion, the Yale Review, The Guardian, Aeon, Emergence, Literary Hub, Outside, and others. She has received grants and fellowships from the U-Cross Foundation, the Minnesota State Arts Board, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources. A former Natural Writers Series writer in residence at Traverse City, Michigan, Erica has taught at the Orion Writers Workshop, the Fishtrap Gatherings of Writers, and the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology. So that's just a bit of her bio. So welcome, Erica. I'm really excited to see you today and to start this conversation.
Thank
So
you so much. Well, I am honored to be here with all of you and with Project Coyote, doing such incredible work. And I just wanted to start by throwing out my own book suggestion that seeing these are making me think of. And it's a book by Charles Foster called Being a Beast. And he actually tries to live as an otter. Let's see, what is it? A badger, an otter, a fox, a deer, and a swift. So he like puts himself in the soil and is living in a little burrow. And it really made me think differently about being an animal human, like a human animal, and what the limitations are. And he reaches a point of like learning that he's seeing and smelling in different ways, and that soil has a richer texture than like what any of us might know. So, to the degree that we're all talking about how we change our perceptions of more than human or non-human animal bodies, I also think thinking about the limitations of like ourselves, the limitations and thrills of thinking about ourselves as animals is one of the things that both Vanessa's beautiful book and I'm interested in. And with that kind of in mind, I was thinking rather than read about Wolfish, which is, of course, about a very charismatic megafauna, the wolf. We've all perhaps spent time envisioning what it is like inside a wolf's head. And I was thinking a about how what it means to relate through stories through to other kinds of living beings. And so I'm just going to take you for a few paragraphs into an exhibit at the Portland Art Museum, which is where I live in Oregon. And they hosted the US debut of Symbiosis, which is a Dutch VR project based on the work of Donna Haraway, which people, if you haven't looked into her work, she writes beautifully. She has a dog. She writes about being kin with dog and wolf species, as well as like much wilder ways of kinship. And so her book, Staying with the Trouble, this ecofeminist book from 2016, artists decided to create a performative, multi-user, and multi-sensory installation where the human body is redesigned to merge with technology and nature. So I will make sure that the link gets set out. It was published in Aeon magazine, this essay, which is just about sort of like being in another animal being with the help of, in this case, technology. So I'll just read you a little bit. I signed up immediately. I'd been intrigued by a section in the blurb about being able to inhabit a butterfly, but when it came time to select the life form that I would embody, another participant there was quicker to claim it. And so I, a deferential animal, found myself in the last remaining available costume, slime mold. Immobilized in a straitjacket-like sleeping bag with a headset puffing oxytocin at me, I tried to relax into my 25-minute experience. My field of vision became hallucinatory. Occasional animal-esque shadows passed before me, but mostly my world consisted of firework-like sprays of color. Balloons expanded and contracted around my body as if I were bubbling. Twice I was nudged to open my mouth, and in went a Michelin chef orchestrated nibble devised through molecular gastronomy to mimic the proteins a slime mold would taste, algal and jellied, then wafery and sweet. So just to be clear, you step into an outfit that is supposed to mimic what it feels like to be this creature, and then you are seeing what this would see and feeling in all for 25 minutes. It's trying to multisensorily bring you into another being. Will you believe me if I say that as a slime mold, the chatter of my human mind began to fade? That for a few seconds at a time, I forgot who and where I was, forgot that a week earlier, a childhood friend of mine had died too young, that dragging my human body around had, in the sorrowful days since, felt both impossible and rude. And then suddenly it was time for the attendant to help me wiggle out of my suit. I stood in the dim gallery, slightly clammy and blinking. I kept catching myself looking at my limbs and wiggling my fingers, as if I were on a low dose of psychotropic mushrooms. A 2022 study in Scientific Reports has found that relational group VR, doing VR sort of with other people, can have a cognitive effect compared to that of a medium dose of LSD or psilocybin, sparking what scientists call self-transcendent experiences, where the boundary between self and world splinters. Now, I had to re-enter not only my environment, but my human body, which felt almost as surreal as those first seconds in the body of a slime mold. Part of the strangeness of trying to connect with any species beyond ourselves is the act of grasping can feel oddly familiar. Every day, in the office and around the dinner table, we confront the emotional distance between other bodies and ourselves. To perform the non-human is also to consider the ways we perform the human and police others' performances of it too. Imagining what a parrot thinks when he imitates words, writes environmental and gender scholar Kari Whale, is also to imagine what a human means when she opens her mouth. How do we know what our lovers mean when they say, I love you, she writes. She's a beautiful essay about listening to her parrot say, I love you, and it like defamiliarized listening to humans say, I love you. And like, what is language? Which I think all of us who have been around animals a lot, we really hear them speak in different ways, right? Outside the exhibit, it was a late afternoon in February, the sunlight muted and metallic. Fumbling for my gloves, I realized I was a few feet from one of my fellow symbiosis participants. This woman was about my grandmother's age, shaking her head with awe. She had just emerged from being the front half of a deep-sea fish. It was clear we were both struggling to put words to what we'd experienced, but it was also clear that neither of us wanted to leave. We made fumbling small talk for a block, and then trading smiles, we said goodbye. She didn't know the grief bubbling inside me, and I didn't know the feelings hiding inside her, but we understood something about each other that nobody else on the sidewalk did. When, stepping into her car, she raised a few fingers to wave, I knew what she meant. The language of a hand, in this case, was enough. This was the moment I kept thinking about from that day. Not that I'd become a slime mold, but that in occupying the imagined gaze of another being, I had become reattuned to the limits and thrills of my own human sensory world. When a breeze arrived with a whiff of trash, I held my breath, then, looking at the crow above me, wondered what she smelled. My umwelt wobbled. There was so much I did not know about how to best occupy my body on our warming earth. A squirrel vaulted off a power line, her tail fluffing into a perfect parachute. I marveled at her. I wanted to be her, but then she was gone, and I was left with the warm animal of myself. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful and such a great essay. And I saw that Anna posted the link in our chat. So thank you for that. Yeah, so much to think about. And, I know in Wolfish, you trace the journey of OR7. And for those who are unfamiliar with who OR7 is, maybe you can just explain briefly who that is.
Yeah.
And the question I have for you is, how did walking alongside that wolf like inform your journey of walking about the world, similar to what you're talking about, right? Like what was it like to sort of inhabit that wolf's reality as you kind of traverse your own stories throughout the book? I mean, especially meditating on fear and the stories you tell about fear. So if
Yeah.
you could do that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I grew up in Oregon and my family include my grandfather had a sheep farm, and so I grew up like helping with young sheep, bottle feeding them in the bathtub when they were not being fed and knowing the risks of predators. And so when I heard that wolves were, repopulating Oregon, that was kind of what I thought of. That was part of my lens. And at the same time, part of my family in Montana includes taxidermists, big game hunters, environmentalists, conservationists, really across the whole spectrum of sort of like environmental beings that I was studying academically. And I just was really thinking about my uncle in Montana had a bumper sticker that said wolves government sponsored terrorism. And I was trying to figure out what that wolf was that he was thinking about because it was different than the wolf that I was thinking about. And like I became interested in this idea of the shadow wolf that is really human projection. I use the word cultural taxidermy in the book. Like every animal, all the stories you all conjured at the beginning of this session, like help create our sense of what it feels like to relate to these creatures. They're human stories, human projections, right? And so I was trying to untangle those. At the same time, OR7 was a wolf who left his pack in northeastern Oregon around the time that I was moving to college on the East Coast. And OR7 became the first known wolf collared to step into Western Oregon in about 60 years. And then the first wolf in California. And there was just this kind of fervor following OR7. Maybe some of you are people familiar with this. Like the National Enquirer wrote about OR7. There was a bumper sticker that said OR7 for president. There was this kind of like animal celebrity nature that I think we have with a number of other, especially charismatic megafauna creatures. But this became a way. I think OR7 was my spark bird, which is a term in birding. Like, what is the bird that gets you really interested in it? And watching OR7 and specifically watching other people watch him from where I was a college student and I was thinking about going out on my own and sort of like OR7, I had left a family and, I didn't want to. I think in these kind of conversations about anthropomorphism, we tend to talk about like, is it right or wrong to look at this animal and see ourselves? But like I was taking poetry classes along the same time I was taking science classes. I was always looking at wolves as their own biological beings and also thinking we are both two creatures that have left home and are looking for connection or looking for new places to go. And so, in sort of tracing the narratives around OR7, I started thinking about the same fairy tales that frustrated me with wolf narratives. Like some of you wrote in the chat, Little Red Riding Hood, actually really frustrated me about what it felt like to grow up in a young woman's body as well. And I think understanding that, like, so many of these same narratives that kind of ensnare animals in unfair ways are also harmful to us. And I became really like impassioned by the idea that we needed to think about like social justice and animal justice and like environmental issues were not really dissimilar from social issues. And mentions of a lone wolf shooter that actually makes people scared of wolves in a way that is just not accurate. And we'll talk back to this, right? So yes, exactly. It's all ecological and interspecies justice. These things are connected. Um, So, yeah, looking at OR7 in a way, OR7 was just one collared wolf. Yes, he walked thousands of miles, but was he this superlatively talented wolf? No, he was a wolf with a collar. I mean, yes, he did walk very far and he eventually found a mate. And biologists told me that, they got letters saying that people thought that they'd planted a mate because it was like the rom-com was too good in the public eye. And that really interested me that people like, our projections, our human projections were so deep on this animal. But at the same time, um, this was just a wolf with a collar that we could track, and I am just a person with a collar. Like I only know my own journey through the world, thinking about fear and sort of the human narratives and the challenges of being an animal in our very digital world for any of us, right? And so I felt like weaving our two narratives and our two journeys could show us something about the larger experiences of being alive today. And like both OR7 and I are living, and we're all living in a habitat that's at threat. We're living in times of interspecies disconnection, the sixth extinction, and in more ways than not, we're obviously connected.
Yeah, it was a really brilliant way to sort of weave all these themes and ideas together in the book, and to follow his journey. Yeah, I'd love to talk about the lone wolf as a story, and how that shifts our perception of, like you said, not just wolves but ourselves, and really just creates this fear, and just the myth of the lone wolf in and of itself. And also the alpha wolf, the stories we tell about the alpha wolf, the way we use that language in relation to other people. Yeah, I would love for you to speak to that.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting thing because early on, I had had a boyfriend who said, I'm just a lone wolf. Like, that's why we got to break up because I'm a lone wolf. And later, when I was studying about wolves, I thought, like, a lone wolf does not just go it alone forever. Like, why does a young wolf leave their pack? They're leaving to connect with other wolves, to find new territory, to find new plot. Like, they're ultimately leaving to connect. And the aim is that. And secondly, like when a wolf is in this period of being lone, it's the most vulnerable time in their life. Wolves hunt so communally, they hunt together, they take care of each other in all these myriad ways. And when they're isolated, they're at risk of territorial threats from other packs and cars. You have more road deaths. Like many things are really dangerous about that period of being a lone wolf. And I started thinking about both like us wanting to understand these kind of disperser wolves better, and how that is a huge part of the narrative of wolf repopulation in the West is not, wolves being reintroduced and flown in, but very much it's wolves like wandering very far. And this disperser lone wolf is a huge engine of that. But also to think about how the metaphors we use about animals in human contexts end up distorting both the animal and the human. And like, for example, this idea of a lone wolf shooter, the next time I saw that headline after knowing what I knew about biological, the Canis lupus wolf, I thought like, what if I see the lone wolf as actually someone who's extremely vulnerable, not extremely threatening. And like this idea that this wolf would rise from nowhere and is all alone is not at all what a lone wolf is in a wolf context. It's like coming and looking for connection. And that actually helps me maybe think differently about some of the social metaphors around lone wolf. Similarly, like this idea of alpha wolf, you look at the original, there's a great New Yorker piece about this that's sort of like a short blurb version, but you look at the original research on alpha wolves, and it was done on various wolves in captivity that were not related, that were put together in a pen. And then there were these like extrapolations made about wolf behavior, which is sort of like, looking at a random group of humans in a hospital waiting room and then deducing like how human families work. Like it's just not an accurate way. And so I think a lot about like what are other wolf metaphors that can be used because the wolf looms so large in storytelling. And I think for one of that reason is that wolves have lived on almost every other continent. They're in the steppe, they're on the ice, they're in the desert, and like they exist in so many stories around the world. And I think a lot of those stories actually highlight the communality and the fact that biologists refer to step wolf, and they refer to foster families, and they refer to many of the same sort of arrangements of humans have, like these immigrant wolves that are accepted. And whereas a lot of the narratives in sort of the dominant American wolf is like the lone wolf on the mountain, the wolf that is kind of wolf, and not the collaborative wolf. And so I was really looking for stories that could, how can looking at wolves as collaborators within their own packs help us think about the way that we need to think about being.
Yeah, that is so interesting. The thing that's coming up for me too now as you talk, there's like the other narrative of this connection between women and wolves and rewilding and women who rub the wolves and this idea of like looking to the wolf to help us undo our domestication in a way, or to peel back layers or to reconnect with our authentic self. And I'm just curious if you've thought about that too.
Well, and you have so much had those, like it's your book also, it seems like in these moments of did looking at creatures become like a gateway to thinking about a more liberatory way to be in your own body?
Well, definitely, yeah. And one of the things I mentioned in the book and just in my work in general, how just realizing how plant blind I had been for most of my life, and then learning how to wildcraft, learning how to forage. I felt that really reconnected me to my animal nature because I became so much more aware of my environment and the other species in it. So, walking around the world in the woods and even in the urban wild with so much more awareness of this multi-species environment as alive and as a place where I can forage and eat and find food. And, so that definitely connected me to my animal nature and in a much, much, much different way than having to outsource everything. Even having to grow things, foraging felt very animal to me. So definitely, yeah, I
Mhm.
felt very connected. To my animal nature in a different way. And I continue to the more intimate I become with the natural world, and specifically other species, plants, fungi, just more aware of my environment in general, having more situational awareness as well.
Yeah, I think we sort of underestimate how, like, going foraging for mushrooms, you also have to look at what sort of trees and undergrowth. And, like, we sometimes think, like, it's just this one thing. Like, if you're looking at wolves, you're just looking at wolves. But, like, you can't look at the wolf without also looking about how grizzly bear populations are also rising with wolf because they're, eating differently. They're feeding off of each other's kills. That's affecting how bears hibernate. Like, these things are so interconnected. And I think, telling a story that's hypothetically about the wolf, the biggest message that I got was like, oh no, the wolf just becomes like this little kaleidoscope through which now I see the whole world through the wolf. And I see the trees that wolf, a wolf walking through the woods is going to know the gender what of the other wolf that just passed. They're going to know what that wolf ate. They're going to know how they are, like that sort of to my mind, like magic of being able to walk through the woods and deduce those things based on scent markings is really like it enlivens our sense of what it means to like walk through the woods, period. And so I guess I would say that, to go back to like how that affects us as humans, I think that so much, I'm seeing some in the chat about this, like so much of how I go through my world right now is feeling like overwhelmed and overstimulated and sort of digitally exhausted. And there's so much about just thinking about myself as an animal, thinking about what am I noticing? What would a wolf be noticing? What would a slime mold be noticing right now? That becomes like a restorative way to move through the world. And one example that I think about is I recently learned that oak trees, the reason their saplings will grow so quickly after being like trampled is that a long time ago they evolved to grow up after elephants stepped on them.
Oh,
And
wow.
this idea that elephants were once where I am in the Pacific Northwest, these prehistoric, creatures, has connected me to prehistoric megafauna in a way that now when I walk through the woods and I see like an oak sapling, I'm like thinking about the elephant, and that's amazing, and like the interconnectivity across time and space. And I just think like that's a really helpful way of like deep thinking into time. whereas our news feeds, our algorithms are not deep thinking.
Completely agree. One thing I've been meditating on a lot lately, and this is something I've been writing about as well, is just our genetic memory. And I've often said this, that learning how to forage, learning about, which plants are medicinal, which ones aren't, which ones not to eat, but it feels like a deep remembering rather than something new I'm learning. And I feel like we all have this. It can be awakened within us. And this amnesia that we have of thinking that we're somehow disconnected from nature is so recent in the history of humanity. It's very new. And I think that's very hopeful to think about. It's just barely on the surface, but our deeper knowledge is so ancient, you know. So
Well, and I think that makes me think about someone in the chat just wrote about taking kids to a wolf sanctuary. And I think like watching young people in the natural world is such a lesson in like the degree of fascination with like bending down and wanting to pick up a bug or like investigate something. Like there's a way of seeing that is, I think, intrinsic that we can all think about like how to refine that kind of childlike curiosity moving through the world, the natural world.
yeah, absolutely. So I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, just as like bridging scientific accuracy with emotional resonance. And you do that, I feel like you do that so well in your writing and even just in your reflections and the piece that you read. So, how are you weaving that together? Because it obviously is really important to have the scientific fact as accurate as possible, but also to connect emotionally with other species. So, how do you approach that in your writing?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was like I remember a review later that was like a positive review, but Reader's Digest said she uses OR7 as a metaphor for this. And I thought like, no, I don't want this wolf to be a metaphor. I want this wolf to be a teacher to me that I'm looking to and learning from in the way that I look to and learn from the rabbit that darts through my yard and is like just there in a way, like I think we're always watching each other and witnessing and observing. Um, and oh my gosh, what was I going to say about that? I think, yeah, what else was I going to say about your question? Sorry, I'm looking at the chat now, which is so, I'm just like
There's so
nodding
many good
along to
questions in
everything anyway.
the chat.
Um,
Yeah, I'll just repeat it just in case that's helpful. Just how do you, bridge the gap between the two, if there is even if there is a gap? And I think a lot of scientific writing is changing, but helping the audience feel both just informed about like the facts as we know them, and also feel really
yes.
emotionally connected to other species and the material that you're writing about.
Yeah. No, I think about something. I was reading papers about how wildfire affect wolves a couple years ago, and there was research from Portugal after the fires there that was describing how wolves were known to run toward flame, and they would run toward it because fleeing prey animals are running out of it, and that is like a smart way of finding food. And you could see via some of the collar markings that wolves in California and potentially or seven, I'm sort of forgetting which specific collared wolf it was, but they like moved towards wildfires that we'd had. And that was an example where I thought that was fascinating window into wolf behavior, just purely as wolf behavior. Like this is a super smart animal. And at the same time, I was thinking about what it meant for where I was as a human in my life. I was asking questions like, when does running towards something risky actually feel like the safest thing to do or the smartest thing to do? And when have I potentially, turned towards something that seems ostensibly like a bad idea, but it's like a good idea? Or, and I just think like there's a real porousness between how at all times we are evaluating our own lives. And I just don't think separating the two of those, like, I think the wolf can do that in an amazing level. And also, I can then learn something about wolves and fire that maybe reflects on my own behavior. And I think a lot about this term mechanomorphism that Amitav Ghosh writes about, and the idea that like, grief and love are not human feelings. We do not own them. We do not like have full custody. These are like animal ways of being. And we can argue about what you would label grief or love. Like I think, there's no black and white there, but I do think about to presume that there's not these feelings or to not run right into that is to assume a sort of like mechano way of interacting with other beings when we have more in common than not. And a lot of this is coming from right now. I'm doing a lot of interviews with biologists who are saying things like, this is what I'm learning about cicadas in smoke. But actually, a lot of the same stuff is similar to humans. And like, we don't know yet. But, like on a actually scientific level, too, there are these leaps that we can make between how various species respond. So I think, so much of our world tries to sort of silo us into different disciplines and different species and different nations and different bodies, right? And in fact, I think so much of what my writing is trying to do is like writing against those binaries and writing into the connections.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, just continuing on the emotional resonance, you shared a piece with me that was so heartbreaking about Nora, the leopard seal, who stayed with her um, dead seal pups for like 20 days or something like that. And just really spoke to how other animals experience grief. And so, yeah, I would love to hear just in terms of also the storytelling theme, like how we tell the stories of other animals and their other emotions and nurturing, and kind of what struck you most about that article, and then just kind of like how do you feel like that how is a narrative changing around how we speak about how other animals experience emotions?
Yeah, I would flag the articles published in Defector by Sabrina Imbler, who's an amazing animal writer, writes essays too. And it's, similar in so many ways to the story that was about the mother whale swimming with her dead babies. And I was just talking to my editor at Orion magazine, which is where I last interviewed Vanessa and is wonderful. And the editor there said they've gotten so many pitches about this that are actually, it's become a cliche. And there's, in a way, people keep being drawn to this idea of the like grieving mother carrying the child, the animal, and that there's now a triteness to how these stories are being told. And she was kind of mentioning that offhand, but it was then interesting to see this piece about the mother seal with the dead pups, and so much of why they don't exactly know why the pups are dying, but they're probably giving birth on icebergs that are melting too quickly, and the pups are too small and they're just falling, they're emaciated and they're dying. And it's so I mean, there's like a deep, I think we owe it to when I used to watch movies with animals, and I would feel like I would know the dog would die at the end. I wanted to like fast forward those bits, and I think a lot about like the weight of witnessing these things and like why we have to, and how if I'm a human thinking about climate policy in my own human life, I have to be able to connect my life to the leopard seals and the icebergs that they're not. And I just think like pretending like, again, there's a divide there. There's a real like moral imperative. And I think we as storytellers can make those connections. I was just seeing, I've been working on a story for National Geographic about how climate change in Mongolia is affecting wolf politics, and like wolves are preying on prey animals. And like this meanwhile is kind of, I'm talking to these herders who are talking about the challenges of working in really extreme climates, and then watching all these Black Friday cashmere sales online. And cashmere animals are they're also tied into these stories of drought. And like I think what so many stories should and can do is like draw the connections between those. Like the wolf has something to do with the cashmere sweater, which has something to do with the climate change. And I would just flag a book called The Second Body by Daisy Hildyard, where she really writes about the idea that we have one body that's here physically, and we have all of you are occupying in clothing, and then there's another body that's kind of the resources we use and the spillover effects of all of these, and that like in climate change we are implicated in all these other bodies in different ways. um, and so yeah, I guess this mother animal piece has also really resonated with me because in Wolfish I was thinking a lot about the trope of the mother wolf and so many of the really horrible ways that wolves have been killed over the 100 years in America and actually all over have been like weaponizing a mother's love for her young and capturing a pup, and then when the pup is making noise like using that to draw the mother, and just like to me just the like cruelest ways that like the deep connection that a mother wolf has with her young has been sort of exploited by human hunters over time. And I was thinking about how when I've gone hiking with my family in Montana, backpacking in the backcountry, my grandpa would always say, like, the biggest thing to be afraid of is the mother bear, is the mother of this. Like, she's the fiercest one. And how this mother is both like this being that I can be afraid for and afraid of. And like that duality was also then kind of interesting thinking in human contexts. And again, like sort of the flattening ways we talk about mothers or women in culture, and like how can thinking about mothers as like more complex beings in wolf realities help us in human realities too. And one of the things the scientists say in regard to this mother leopard seal and her young is like, we don't know why a mother creature would be by her young after they pass. Like there's curiosity, there could be saving them from territoriality. Like there's this whole sort of like slate of possibilities that we could read into how creatures connect, and rather than, but probably there is some sort of grief there, and the scientists are sort of like thinking that. And to me there's like just a lot of imagination that's interesting in those ideas of like, we don't we don't know what it feels like to be a leopard seal that can't keep your young alive, but like we have to step into trying to understand that, I think.
Yeah, beautiful. I totally agree. So I know you're working on a new book, and I'm just, curious if you'd like to share a little bit about that and what some of that research is bringing up for you.
Yeah, I am thinking right now specifically about how animals are connecting in climate change, and specifically like how their mating or relational behavior is changing. And early on, I heard a story about sea turtle eggs in sand that are turning more female in hotter temperatures, and scientists were using little umbrellas to try to shade the eggs so as to like not have such skewed gender. And that just made me really interested thinking about this. And so I've been talking to researchers who are studying how, for example, like dragonfly wings have a lot of different ornamental colors which help them like territorially fight for mating, or also attract their mates. And those are heat sinks. So the dragonflies that are most ornamented are also most overheated. And slowly, dragonfly wings are changing their patterns and changing their colors. And I think, part of this, like that is both feels sad to me on a human level, and it also feels like adaptation. This is actually kind of cool. Like there's different coatings on dragonfly wings that are helping them adapt. And so I've just been talking to a number of biologists about these topics. And I will say that one of the things that's really interesting is how many of the biologists studying how smoke affects animals have had experiences with wildfires in their own lives. They've lost their own homes, they've had to evacuate from their own homes, and that is causing them to ask these questions about animals. So, again, another pledge for just how these are not different in our own lives. And I would like ask you, the next time you experience an extreme, not you, Vanessa, but you, all of you, like the next time a natural disaster or a moment of extreme weather comes, try to think into like, what is this like for my other species of neighbors, and how are they reacting to this? So I will say there's like a lot of very hopeful stories that are coming out of the research that I've been doing now. And a lot of them is just about how, when in community, species cortisol levels will be lower, even though maybe they're macaque monkeys living after a hurricane, but if they're together, they're healthier, right? And a lot of the scientists that I'm talking about are talking to are finding a lot of like, once again, buoyedness in how the sort of really inventive ways, like guppies that are getting sick in heating water, more likely are like self-isolating from their schools. They're kind of staying away, and that's incredible. And how can we, in our time of pandemics, like learn something from that again? So I'm using these animal stories both to like learn about what these other species are doing in this really extreme time we're in, but also to think for my own way. I need stories of hope and futurity, and I need to think about how I can be in connection with other people better, because otherwise I just want to put my head under a pillow and, I'm not ready to give up in any way yet.
That is absolutely fascinating. And when does your next book come out?
Still very in progress, hopefully 2027, but still in the writing phase.
Amazing. So I'll ask you one more question, then we'll turn it over to audience questions, which it looks like there's a lot of really interesting ones. And you spoke to this a little bit, but I just love to hear you just think about a little bit more, just like what would more inclusive climate storytelling look like including other species more than human animals in storytelling about climate change, and how might that also benefit us?
Yeah, I was recently lecturing to college students about works of literature that use a animal point of view. There's some really wonderful fiction, and one that I would flag is Talia Kulori's book. I can put her name in the chat later, but she just writes really beautifully about this. And I was asking the college students, like, why would you write from a more than human point of view? And it was like unanimously clear. They said, well, humans are terrible. We hate humans. We don't relate to humans. Like all of the college students were just like, I like my dog better than I like the average human I run into. And that was really instructive. This is granted a small sample size in Vermont, but made me think about the ways that we really do have so much empathy for these creatures who we see as in our sort of time of feeling really frustrated with fellow humans, feeling like we're greedy or we're a scourge or so one of these things. Um, how can, rather than spending so much frustration, feeling so frustrated with other humans, how can we like flip that and turn that into so much kinship with other beings, and just like focusing more on those positive kinds of connection rather than our own rage scrolling or whatever. Um, so I do think there's a lot of possibility in that. And I guess I'm thinking about how much, like, after the wildfires in Maui, there was huge fundraising to help animals there as well. And in a way, that lens of looking at this wildfire became like, was a maybe like it's I don't know, it was a new and useful way of looking at like a whole human group civilization, not like town being wiped out. So yeah, I don't know what else I would say about that except that yeah, that's the most illiterate like ending of a point, but
Well, it's a big question, and it's
it's a great question.
yeah.
I'm
Well,
curious what you would how you reflect on that.
just briefly, one of the things that has come up a lot in these conversations and today too is just that um, as humans, we can make an incredibly positive impact on the environment. That's something I continue to think about. That we can be stewards of the environment, and so considering our local ecosystems, other species, and when it comes to climate change, that can bring out the best in us, I think,
Mhm.
and calls for stewardship. And we have the ability to really alter our environment in positive ways. So I think like recentering that as much as possible, which is something that I always try to do when I get
Totally.
out and listening to the news,
Yeah.
that we have the ability to make do incredible work on behalf of other species. So the more we learn about our ecosystems, the better off all of us are going to be, obviously, because as everyone here knows, we're all interconnected. So That's kind of briefly what I would.
Barbara Kingsolver, the novelist, has a great point where she makes the difference between hope and optimism, and she says like a hopeful person, say you're like in a cabin and winter's coming, and the optimist would say winter's going to be fine. I'm not going to put any root vegetables in the bottom. And the pessimist would say we're all going to die, so I'm stockpiling all the root vegetables. But the hopeful person is like it might be hard, it might be okay. I'm going to put some vegetables there, but I'm like hoping that things are going to be okay this winter and that we're not going to starve. And I'm sort of butchering it, but it's made me think about like we have, I think, a duty to hope. We all can have a duty to hope, and that doesn't mean we have to have a duty to like feel blindly optimistic. And the ways that optimism can be a sort of like myopia, where then you just are like, it'll be fine, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. But hope doesn't cost any, like my hope lives alongside my rage, and I need that hope. And I think one of the things, I'll just end with this idea that I learned from a biologist talking about baby wolves. And he said, you know, wolves are born really afraid. But what do they do when they're afraid? Like if a, and you've seen this maybe with puppies, like if a wolf pup hears something under a bush, they're going to go to investigate it, and they're going to see what's going on. I need to kind of sniff this out. And so fear in that case becomes a gateway to curiosity, investigation. Um, and that was really instructive for me because I thought, how often does fear hypothetically, my human fear makes me like shrink in, makes me turn away, makes me want to numb out. But like the wolf pup's way of being afraid that I can like learn from is what if I'm sort of going out and investigating this more and thinking into these ideas. And so I think hope can sometimes feel scary, can feel like what does this mean? But I just think there's absolutely no other way.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm
Ah,
excited.
such a great conversation. And Anna, I want to turn it over to you because I know there was a lot of great audience questions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and let you ask away.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we've got, we have a question about the differences or similarities between storytelling and a case study.
Mm, that's such a great point. I think a lot about Hmm. I'm trying to think. My position is not raised in the social sciences where case studies are used as much as stories. So maybe part of it is just like what genre you are sort of in. The stories I'm trying to tell maybe are not as contained. The chronologies or the sort of crossing of time and space are a little bit wider than maybe a case study, which is more of like, I think about when I was in geology and we would take core samples of the ground and you like drill down and it's like one geological sort of core sample is a bit more of maybe a case study, like what's one person, what's one wolf you're looking at, whereas the story is like you're making meaning of that one being in the context of larger things. Vanessa, do you have more insight on that?
I think that's I think that's a really good answer. I would say something similar. And I think what you spoke to earlier in the conversation is just finding the connectivity, the emotional connection, the larger scope of finding ways to connect. And one of the things that has come up in other conversations too, and we've talked about this, is just that finding emotional connection through by talking about the species as individuals. I think like you spoke to, the way we talk about other species can turn it into a story. It can be the same information, but it's just the way that more the lyrical way we might tell that story. Anyway, I could go on, but I want to make sure you get all your questions. But I think your answer was great.
No, I love how you're adding to that. Oh, really quickly, I just see someone asked who was the author of Second Body, and it was Daisy Hildyard, Hildyard. She writes fiction as well, but the Second Body is all about her relating to animals.
Got another question that says, just occurred to me to question how the term anthropomorphism has negatively impacted our connection to other species.
I bet we could all, I want to turn it to Heather almost and say, how do you think about this? I mean, I do think maybe the first thing that comes to mind is a projection that we, therefore, because we are seeing a animal as a human in some way, we are overriding their experience and projecting our own and assuming that we know or understand where we should be listening. And I think about that like it's sort of like talking as if you understand someone's experience when you actually just need to sit and try to think about it. So I would say that is like the biggest probably downside that I can think of is that we are limited in our imaginations as humans. We have a very anthropocentric way of viewing, and the truth of these other ways of being are more fascinating. I'm thinking about Ed Yong's book about how other beings like experience the world and the way they sense it, and like the way that you even just your Umwelt, that German word for like your sensory sort of lens of the world. Our human vision just like is really just like one sliver of that, and to project that onto other creatures is just missing a lot. Vanessa, would you add anything there?
I think that that's a great answer. I wouldn't add to that.
Yeah, I see a question that Ben Young wrote about giving charismatic animals cute human names and leading us to put emotions and motivations onto them. Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, one of the ways that I've sort of pushed against that for myself is not just writing about wolves, but trying to write about slime mold or think about, it's a lot harder to anthropomorphize something that doesn't look at all like me, like doesn't have a central nervous system. Like think about oysters, think about shrimp, think about other beings that are maybe like I think pushing yourself to think about how to be in connection with these creatures that are less human centric is interesting.
And we've got a specific question about a chapter in your book, Wolf versus Girl. Um, so they say so many of your cultural and social association with women and wolves focus on how they are both predator and prey and both transgress boundaries. Do you have any thoughts about stories, fiction, myth, nonfiction, that focus on the positive connections between humans, but especially women and other animals?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I mean, there's so many. I will say one that I just blurbed, and it's coming out in the spring, and it's called Black Bear by Trina Moyles. And she worked as a wildlife lookout in Canada. And she is surrounded by bears, huge numbers of black bears up there. And she is at first frightened about them. And it's sort of about her coming to coexist with them and watch them. And she has just like extraordinary observations of being a young single woman. Not that those things matter so much, but she's thinking about cultural narratives around predator and prey, but is ultimately like in union with these bears in a really interesting way. And so I really, especially for anyone who lives in black bear habitat, it's fantastic. And I think, someone who wrote Women Who Run with Wolves, like there is this sort of like whole lineage of thinking into women and wolves. And Vanessa's book does this beautifully too. So yeah, I guess I would just cite both of those as well.
Allison says, how do we get others to broaden their minds to see whole picture, which includes other species and their inherent right to live on this planet and not as resources or targets?
I think some of this comes down to language that we're using, like reminding, just like as a journalist or storyteller in whatever job, when you're doing communications, like, is this animal an it? Is this animal a more sentient being? Like, how can we use language that is projecting and showing agency in other beings? That's huge. And I mean, I really think not as resources or targets is so important. And there was a study about how wolves scared deer off roads, and so fewer cars were hitting deer, and so it was saving humans a lot of money to have wolves back. And this became a big headline. A lot of people sent it to me, and I felt like, okay, that's fascinating. It's fascinating that wolves are affecting the presence of deer on roads. At the same time, wolves should not be back to save humans money. Like, that is not the takeaway that I want. But that is a convincing argument that maybe helps policy get made. And so just thinking about those different, the different ways that you can tell the story, what would a different way to talk about, animals on the roadside be?
This next question kind of goes into how we talk about animals and how we write about animals. Peggy says, I've noticed that stories written from the animal's point of view are typically marketed towards children, whereas young adult and adult novel are written from a wolf's perspective is relatively rare. Why do you think this is?
I do think part of this is that, like what we were talking about earlier, where humans just have a young humans are more open. And I was talking earlier about like VR research, and they've found that when you have a child that is playing the game as being a sea turtle in VR, they had the sea turtle sort of swimming through trash and experiencing what a sea turtle would experience in the world, and the children logged those visuals that they were seeing were logged in the memory part of their brain, not in the entertainment part of their brain. And this researcher told me that essentially children are seeing themselves, it's more porous, how they see themselves as other creatures, right? And as adults, we sort of get crystallized in our own perspectives, and we would think, oh, this is what a sea turtle experience is, but not what I experience. And so I think our stories have reflected that. And I also think there's a lot of really great pushing against this. And there's a book called Open Throat by Henry Hoke, Hoke. And he writes about a mountain lion in Los Angeles that's a queer mountain lion living near Hollywood. It's totally weird premise, but the opening page, if you read nothing else but that, it's sort of describing what helicopters would sound like and like how to make sense of freeway noise and helicopter noise. And it just has the amazing quality of making the familiar strange, which I think a lot about what good animal writing can do is it can make us walk through the world in a different way. Open Throat is the name of the book.
Thank you so much. I feel like that's a great place to leave it because we're at time. I feel like we could just talk for hours about this. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so, so much. And we'll try and gather as many links as possible for the follow-up email. And if you have links that you want to share, Erica, too, we'll try and follow up with that, with your articles and your books, obviously. But yeah, so much food for thought. Thank you. This has been a really, really, really interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for the thoughtful questions and your amazing writing. And thank you, all of you, for having these conversations in the chat. There's this whole web of things I want to be responding to there. And it's really exciting. And I feel buoyed and hopeful just to know this community is here. We're nourishing each other. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for all of your engagement and your great questions. And thank you, Anna and Project Coyote. Yeah, look forward to seeing you next time.
Take care. Thank you, Project Coyote.